Okay, we're in part 2, chapter 6. The system of providence, or the order of providence. Here he goes into detail about something which I mentioned very briefly, that when God judges and evaluates the actions of people and then responds to them, which is part of providence. Obviously, providence involves much more than just evaluating actions and responding to them. The whole of nature has to be coordinated, and the ecosystem and global warming and all the rest have to be taken care of. But the purpose of it all is human actions. So he uses a system of courts, just like every civilized society has a system of courts to evaluate actions, and in particular to punish infractions. So, and we have it as well in our earthly system. So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses a similar system. And I don't know why the translator here refers to tribunals. The word in the Hebrew is courts, and our courts have 3 or 23 or 72, and sometimes in between numbers. So I don't think you should take the word tribunals literally. And there are courts with different types of jurisdiction. For example, in order to try a capital case, you have to have a court with 23 members. You cannot do it with a court of 3. And in order to judge the validity of other judgments or the validity of laws and so forth and so on, or create new laws, you need the whole of the Sanhedrin, which is 72. So there are different types of jurisdiction that the different courts have, and they have different status. And of course, you can appeal from a lower court to a higher court, whether it's a different type of court or whether you have, let's say, an outlying court of new judges versus a more established court of older judges, more experienced judges who are superior in their wisdom, and they can sometimes review and revise judgments of lower courts. Each court has its own procedures. If something is being evaluated, so all the aspects of the situation have to be represented. These are angels which deliver testimony, and as we have said in the past, testimony of a human's action requires not only external observation, but has to take into account his internal qualities as well. His character traits, his fears, his inspirations, his worries, all of that has to be taken into account. So each dimension of information is represented by a different angel, and they present the information to the court so that it can make its decision. You had a question?
No, I just wanted to say, here it says government. Like,
where?
No, in this book.
Oh, yeah, I should say.
Just wanted to point out.
Yeah, okay, you're right. In a way, you're right. Here he speaks about, the very first sentence, he talks about management.
Right.
But government is not quite right either. It carries connotations in English that the Hebrew doesn't carry. You're right. I think you're right. Now, having said all that, he says here again what he said in the previous chapter, that you have this system of courts, higher courts and lower courts, and each one has its rules and so on. But God is present in every court and manages the procedures of every court and oversees the process of every court and the outcome of every court. So if God is doing that, you'll ask, well, so what does he need all the intermediary courts for? And the answer is he doesn't need them for making things easy, so he has more time for vacation, because the hirelings are taking care of the easy cases. No, it's to describe a certain certain structure of divine operation. Different courts represent divine operation based on different types of considerations. And sometimes he operates with some types, like local considerations, and sometimes he operates with broader considerations. Sometimes you take into account the action of the person himself, sometimes the relationship of the action of the person to others, sometimes the needs of the nation as a whole. I think I mentioned to you one tiny illustration of this. Rav Dessa says one of the reasons there are 2 days of Rosh Hashanah is because on the first day you are judged in terms of your actions and the mitzvahs that you do, vis-a-vis your capabilities and your responsibilities. The second day, you're judged with respect to how much other people depend upon you. And you might not even know. It's not that you went out of your way to help other people. You might not even know that other people are looking at you and they're taking inspiration from you. You might be totally unconscious of it, but they are doing that. And since this is an effect that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants in the world, someone who doesn't make it on the basis of his own evaluation may nevertheless earn the right to live out a year on the basis of the fact that other people need him. So the different courts here express different perspectives and different types of information that are taken into account in the judgment that is made. You wanted to ask something? No, okay, I misunderstood your hand. Okay. Now, one of the elements in this process is that a person's actions are not judged until he is accused. So the picture here of the court is not reward. That's left out of the chapter entirely. As far as I can tell, I didn't see even a hint to that. And part of the reason for that could be what I told you a week ago or so, that the Talmud says, there's no reward in this world, and we understood that to mean adequate reward for what you do can't be paid in this world, because the nature of a mitzvah on the one hand and the possibility in this world for being compensated, there's an incommensurateness between the two of them. A mitzvah is performed by the soul and the body together. The soul is not itself an element of space-time. The soul itself is not a physical thing. The soul has a certain spiritual quality which transcends space and time. So whatever events are going to take place in this world are events within space-time. They impinge directly on the body, and then through the body, of course, on the soul as well. But there's nothing in this world that could match the quality of a mitzvah, which is the result of the soul using the body to perform God's will. There's nothing in the world that could match it. So the judgments in this world are judgments of either one or another type of suffering, and we had 8 different principles why people suffer, or incentive, some kind of incentive to what they're doing, or what the Rambam called, what I call the keys to the warehouse, where you can be given easier conditions in this world to perform more mitzvos, so as to earn more merit, so as to get more real reward in the world to come. But the idea of rewarding your good actions, the real reward, that can't take place here. So I think that's why he doesn't mention that aspect of the. So the trigger for the judgment is the appearance of the prosecutor, and there are rules for the prosecutor, when he can appear and what he can say and who can respond and how much credibility he has. All of that is variable. And that's part of the system that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to manage the judgments that are made in our world. That's really the bottom line in the chapter. And as he says, there are many, many details, and the details we don't understand all of them. We don't know all of them. Okay, and I have nothing to say anymore about the details that are mentioned in the chapter. That's all I have to say about it. We're together? Okay, now chapter 7 talks about the influence of the stars. And here, it's a very short chapter, but there's room for considerable mistake. Let me describe the general system here. Are the stars just pinpoints of light in the sky? No. They are related. Now, for those of you who don't know my background, my field in philosophy was mathematical logic and philosophy of mathematics. So I choose my words very carefully. I could make a mistake, but if you use a word different from mine, you're not repeating what I said. And if my words are wrong, then I'm wrong, because I mean the words that I say. The relationship of the stars to what happens in the world. I didn't say the stars do it, create it, organize it, own it, are in charge of it, decide for it. I'd say any of those things. I said there's a relationship. There's a relationship. The relationship of the stars to what happens in this world is a complex, detailed relationship of which we have received some information about this relationship, and some of it we have not received. So, he says here what the Rambam says word for word in the guide. What about systems of astrology? Does our belief that the stars have some relationship to what happens in the world give validity to systems of astrology? And he says, no. Even though astrology might get some things right, it will for sure get many things wrong. I'm talking about the system of astrology. Some things might get right, but we'll get many things wrong. And the Rambam says, for example, if you're going to use the heavenly bodies to predict the future, to get it right would mean to get everything right exactly. If you get 98% right, then you missed it. And if you claim that you're getting this from a source that has a divine stamp, if you get 2% wrong, then you missed it. There can't be anything that's wrong. Many empirical studies have been done which show that belief in astrology is very, very weak, especially the astrology we have today. I don't know what astrology was available in his time 250 years ago, and certainly not further back. But for example, you know that people are born under a certain astrological sign. Now, they did a study sending out questionnaires. Your birth date is this. It was under this and this astrological sign. Here are the characteristics of people who are born under that sign. Tell us whether you identify yourself as having those characteristics. And the results were really quite positive. Much better than chance. Much better than chance. So the believers in astrology took this as evidence that the astrological system works. But then the investigators were very clever. They sent out another survey where they switched the characteristics so that in this new survey, the characteristics associated with the zodiac sign were not the characteristics that astrology says belong to those signs. And they said, here are the characteristics, now phony, which belong to the zodiac sign. And according to your birthday, you were born under that sign. Do you find yourself having these characteristics? And the answer is, yes, we do. We find it also much higher than chance, which means that when they read the questionnaire, they were influenced by the questionnaire to see those things in their lives, to emphasize people's lives are very complex. You cannot reduce a person's life to 2 or 3 characteristics. Lots of characteristics are floating around. And by virtue of the fact that they were told that these are the characteristics which apply to their sign, that's the way they perceive themselves. So there's a great deal of healthy skepticism about the signs. Okay. Yeah.
But, I mean, considering also there is this reference that says that the Rambam says that there is no astrological influence, but as you stated before, there is a relationship, and there might be a way to understand where that relationship stands, no? Like,
Yeah, well, yes, of course. I am meant to assert that. I mean, it's not.
yeah, no, I know you.
There is a relation. Now, I brought the Rambam in only to say that the systems of astrology that the non-Jews have aren't genuine systems because they will never get everything right. I didn't bring him in to certify the positive side that the Ramchal is saying.
No,
right?
no, I know.
Okay, so now structurally the way it works is this, that there's a certain divine quality of action which uses the stars as an intermediary. Just like it uses angels as intermediaries, it uses the stars as an intermediary. And because it passes through the stars or the constellations, that has an effect on the impact because it comes through that channel. There's something they discovered maybe a year ago. You probably learned in biology, in reproduction, that a woman has a whole egg, which is a whole cell, with all the machinery of a cell, and the poor man provides a sperm, which is just half DNA. That's all it is. With a little shell, and the shell disintegrates once it penetrates the wall of the egg, and the DNA unites with the half DNA of the egg, and that's your contribution. Well, like many, many other things, turns out that that's not true. It's not true, because the sperm, from the time that it is created till the time it's expelled, goes through a long, winding tube. It takes something like 2 weeks to get through that tube. And while it's going through that tube, it's picking up molecules which determine what parts of the DNA will be expressed and what parts will not be expressed. And those molecules can be based on the experience of this man. So that qualities that are developed in this man because of his experience can be passed on to the offspring. Yes, Lamarckian evolution. Quite right. Right. They've done unbelievable studies when you had a famine in a certain area for let's say 10 years. People's bodies adjust to the famine. And then their children, who may be born after the famine, will have those qualities because they inherited from their parents. Because it's not just having the DNA, it's what parts of the DNA function, what parts don't function. How is it possible that you have 24 different categories of cells which are shaped differently, have different sizes and different qualities and characteristics when you have all the same DNA? Because not all the DNA is functioning all the time. There are ways to silence certain aspects of the DNA or enhance the operation of the DNA, right? And here you have a mechanism whereby a man can communicate his experience to the offspring, just as a woman can, because similar things happen to a woman. It's because the sperm goes through this tube and it's affected by the qualities of the tube that it comes out the way it comes out. If it didn't go that way, it wouldn't have that effect. So here, Kodesh Baruch Hu Kiviyachol is sort of inserting activity into the creation, but he has a chosen passageway. It's a chosen funnel through which it comes. And that funnel is the stars. And because it comes through the stars, it acquires certain characteristics which it otherwise wouldn't have. Now, that's not the only way in which it reaches us. There can be other ways without going through the stars. So the stars are not zero. It's not that they make no difference in what happens. They do make a difference, but they make a difference because he chooses their influence to go through this channel, and this channel has an effect on it, and he chose it to have that effect. So it's not as if they are in any way independent agents. And indeed, if you look in Maimonides' laws of idol worship, he explains how idol worship started. Originally, of course, everyone believed in the Creator because Adam had prophecy from the Creator, interacted with him directly, and after the flood, Noach also had many prophecies, and some prophecies went to his children as well from the Creator. So there was no question there. So idol worship is a deterioration from an original position of monotheism. And the deterioration took place in the following way. People analyzed how the world works, and they made the following deduction. The sun's very important, right? Without the sun, everything dies. God created the sun, no question about it. And the sun delivers to us the energy and other elements which enable us to survive. So the sun is very important. God made the sun very important. Well, shouldn't we appreciate that? It's his handiwork. And it's his handiwork that he made to enable us to survive. Shouldn't we appreciate the sun as his handiwork? Just like, now comes an analogy, which is terrible deterioration. Just like, for example, you have a king who is the king of the whole realm, and he divides up the realm into separate departments, and he puts a governor over each department. The governor is over the department because the king put him there. If you do something that's disgraceful to the governor, you're really disgracing the king because he put him there. He operates with the king's authority. Shouldn't you appreciate that? Shouldn't you, when you get something from the governor, say thank you to the governor? Say thank you to the governor because he's representing the king, and you're appreciating the king by saying thank you to the governor, right? And the governor takes care of certain local affairs. If you want something from the governor, you address a petition to the governor because he's the one who's taking care of those local affairs, right? So you ask him, you request from him, you acknowledge him, all in the guise of respecting and honoring the king who put him there. But here's a terrible tragedy, because the governor is another human being with his own will, with his own decisions, with his own actions. Something with its own will, its own decision, its own actions can deserve praise, can deserve thanksgiving, and can deserve petition. But if you, for example, consider a surgeon who's doing surgery with a scalpel, an exquisite scalpel, honed in Switzerland, and balanced and extremely sharp and just the right size and so on and so on, and he does an exquisite surgery with it, you better not praise the knife. Better not praise the knife. Don't ask the knife for a good surgery next time, because the knife is just a tool in the hands of the surgeon. The knife has no independence. And here's the crucial mistake. The sun has no independence. The sun has no will. The sun can't act. The sun can't hear your prayers. And that's the mistake that they made. So the initial mistake was not rebelling against the Creator or forgetting about the operation of the Creator. No, but it was misunderstanding the status of the created items that serve His will, that they would have some kind of independent status. That was the beginning of idol worship. Once you do that, once you say, if I'll have a life and death matter, I'll go to the king. That might happen once in a lifetime. In the meantime, my interactions are with the governor, and he's the one I ask him, and I thank him, and I give him presents, and so on and so on. So then you've opened the door to worshiping other things. And then little by little, because the king is managing things that don't have direct relevance to or you can't deal with them in any way, so then all your interactions are with the governors, and then that being the case, your whole focus becomes shifted to the governor. That was the origin and development of idol worship. So here's where you have this very, very tricky thing. To recognize that the stars are related to what happens, but have no independence whatsoever. That's the crucial balance that you have to keep. Yeah.
If the stars are dependent, you said they're not independent, then if non-Jews still have free will, which means they are independent, they're controlled by the muzzle of the stars, which are independent. So how are they independent?
Well, no, you're taking what I'm saying here and you're applying it in an entirely different context. The stars are a channel through which God manages things. The answer to your question is, how much does He manage? To what does He apply His management? And in particular for human beings, he applies his management to supplying them with free will, supplying with the ability to make their own choices. That's what his management does for them. So that's why there's no problem of making room for free will in the place of his management, because that's what his management does for them. This, again, even the Rambam says this pretty clearly. Okay, that's what he says at the very end. He says the system of the stars can't be fully understood through observation. There are rules that are not open to observation, therefore they can't. Now, I want to acquaint you with just a little piece of history of science, because some people worry about this. How many stars are there? Well, the latest estimate is 10 to the 22. That's a 1 with 22 zeros. That's a lot. So some people say, with the universe this vast, I can't believe that we're special. I can't imagine how we, as the stupid astronomers say, we're an ordinary star in an ordinary solar system with ordinary rocks going around it, in an ordinary place in the solar system, and we're just, as one astronomer put it, we are a failure of antiseptic conditions. We're scum which has arisen on this rock because the antiseptic conditions of space weren't applied appropriately to the, so it's like, mold growing in the corners of your living room.
Right.
Yeah, it's really, if you want to deflate your ego, and artificially and illogically, that's the way they do it. So, I can't imagine how, for example, God, the Creator, would care how I absorb my nutrition from the environment. By which he tells you don't eat snails and don't eat crabs and don't eat lobster, especially lobster, and don't eat, cheeseburgers. I can't imagine that God cares about how I absorb nutrition from the environment. Now, I think we should take such a critic at his word. You can't imagine it? Okay, I believe you that you can't imagine it. So what? Because you can't imagine it, therefore you have some reason to think it's not true because you can't imagine it? Since when does the universe have to answer to your imagination? Why should your inability to imagine it give you any reason whatsoever to doubt that it's true? You can't imagine the creator of the universe at all, period. So don't use your imagination. It's the wrong tool. The right tool is, did he communicate with us? And if he did, what did he say? And he said, keep kosher. Okay, I don't know why you're interested in the way I absorb energy from the environment, but you are because you're on record as having said so, and therefore that's what we have to live by. So let's take a look now about, you had a question?
It makes sense to me that we need to thank Hashem for the luminaries because they have a direct source that we can benefit from, like the sun giving us light and the moon also at night giving us light. There's this also idea that Hashem said to Abraham that we're above the stars. So if we're above the stars, and do we still necessarily share that same relationship that they, I don't want to say control what happens, but they have an effect on what happens?
Okay,
And if
so
then how do we praise Hashem for that?
okay, so now you see, this is a good example of where I said something, and I said it in a formula that was what I wanted to take precisely. And again, there's no fault here, but you'll realize now that I said something which you didn't reproduce in the way you described what I said. I said, quoting the Ramchal, quoting Tosfos, that when you say Ein Mazel Yisrael, I said there is a mazel, there is something in place, there are things that direct our circumstances, but we can climb above it. I didn't say we are above it, I said we can climb above it. And that's exactly what God told Abraham. When Abraham said, I see in the stars that I'm not going to have any children, he didn't say to Abraham, no, that's for people below. You're above, pay attention to your geography. And you'll see that it's a silly question. No, he didn't say that. What he said was he took him out, raised him above the stars, and he told him that we could climb above the stars. That was the point of the Gemara in Shabbos, where the workers went out to cut the reeds. You were here when I spoke about that? No?
Yes.
So, and when they came back, there was a poisonous snake in the bag of the Jewish worker. So that when Ablat, the non-Jewish astrologer, said he's going to die, he wasn't just fantasizing. There was a poisonous snake waiting for him. And then Shmuel asked him what did he do. He did an extraordinary action of charity. We have a verse that says, charity saves from death. So again, there are these forces, but a Jew can climb above them. So much of what we do is initially dictated by those forces. Some things are completely bani chayim azoni. Certain things definitely come from those forces. So we can definitely thank God for them that way. Furthermore, the whole of the rest of the world, including the rest of humanity, plays a very big role in our ability to do what we do in doing all of our mitzvahs. They're not just extra and of no use. So I could praise him for having those features in place for the other nations of the world, because they also contribute to the environment in which I do my mitzvahs. And that point is what I wanted to illustrate with a little piece of history of science. There is a term from the German Gedankenexperimenter, which means an imaginary experiment. You imagine certain circumstances, and you ask yourself, what do you think would happen under those circumstances? The greatest scientists have used these types of reasonings, and one of maybe the most famous and the most powerful is by Sir Isaac Newton. Let me ask you a question. This table, is it moving right now?
No. Yeah.
Oh, how could that be? Some say no and some say yes. But isn't this open and shut?
It's relative
Yes, relative to what?
to the place from where you look at it.
Stationary things.
I mean, the Earth is moving, so you're moving. It's moving.
What is it relative to?
Stationary things.
It's relative to everything.
It's relative to anything you want and everything you want. Who says what it should be relative to?
Because movement is defined by...
If it's relative, if you're talking about relative to the floor, it's not moving. So relative to the sun, it is moving. Nobody dictates what it has to be relative to. It's relative to anything you want and everything you want. Motion is relative. When you say that something's in motion, what you mean is this thing is moving with respect to that thing. And if you picked another that thing, then the answer could be different. How fast is it moving? Is it moving straight line or a curved line? All that depends upon what you happen to choose, right?
So it depends on the type of movement. You know.
I'm sorry?
It depends on the type of movement. You have a microscopic movement.
Yes, yeah, Microsoft, right. You have oscillatory movement, you have straight movement, right, 100%. Now, that was a principle which people believed in, Galileo believed in it. Newton said, not always. Not all motion is relative. Not all motion is relative. And he said, I'll prove it to you. Here's my Gedanken experiment. Imagine a giant bucket of water, which is half full. And the bucket is so big that you can sit on the rim of the bucket. Now imagine that the handle is attached by a rope to something holding it up, the limb of a tree or whatever it is, so it's off the ground. Now wind the bucket so that the rope is wound, and then let it go. What's going to happen? The rope will unwind and the bucket will rotate. Bucket will rotate. Okay. Now, imagine you're sitting on the bucket and you're looking up. Wow. Things aren't static, all right. There's definitely motion going on. Between me and the sky, between me and the sun, between me and the fixed stars, there's definitely motion. Shall we say, I'm going around and they're stationary? Shall we say that they're going around in the opposite way and I'm stationary? Motion's relative. Between me and the sky, there's motion going on. And it's relative. Right. Says Newton. That's as long as you look up. What happens if you look down at the water? What are you going to see? The bucket is rotating, right? So the water is going to rotate. And when the water rotates, there's going to be what's called centrifugal force. And centrifugal force, if you're on what do you call them? Where those things?
Roller coaster?
Not a roller coaster, no.
Carousel.
A flat thing that goes, that's in a circle that goes around and around.
Carousel.
Not a carousel.
Talking about a fidget spinner.
It's just a flat piece of metal, and it has a circle, and it has a pole in the center, and it goes round and round.
Carousel. It's called a carousel.
No, carousels, we ride on horses and goes.
Merry-go-round in a puppy.
It goes a merry-go, whatever it is. If you stand halfway from the center, if it goes fast enough, you're going to be pushed off.
Yeah.
It's centrifugal force, right? So what you're going to see when you look down at the water is that the water is creeping up the sides of the bucket. Why is that, pray tell? Why is the water going up the sides of the bucket? Because it's the bucket that's moving, not the sky. That was Newton's bucket experiment to prove that in this case, the motion of the bucket is motion in the bucket, not just relative to the sky. You can say it either way you want. No, it's because that's what's producing the push that pushes the water up the. And on the basis of this, he had absolute space and absolute time and absolute motion, at least sometimes. At least sometimes. Not all motion is relative. That was Newton's famous bucket experiment. And it lasted, I don't know, 100 years or 200 years. It was a gigantic thing. Until someone, I think it was Maxwell, decided to bite the bullet. He said, no, it's not true. It's the fact that the bucket is moving relative to the fixed stars that pulls the water up the sides of the bucket. It's the interaction between the bucket and the stars that pulls it up. Not the bucket. How do you know? How do you know that it's not? How do you know that if all the stars were erased, it wouldn't go up? Maybe it wouldn't go up. You don't know that. Because you're living in a world where the stars are there.
But it has nothing to do with the stars.
You don't know that.
It does, because if you wouldn't turn the rope, then it wouldn't go. There's stars there.
But they don't know.
No, of course it's the motion, but is it the motion of the bucket or the motion of the bucket vis-a-vis the sky?
Did the stars change or did the bucket change? The bucket changed, so it's obviously the bucket.
You don't know that. It's changing vis-a-vis the sky. It's a relative motion, not an absolute motion. Because if the stars weren't there, it wouldn't work. That's what he said.
So that means you have to follow through with that by saying you're not actually twisting the rope. The whole world is twisting around and the rope is getting wound up.
Well, that's the significance of twisting the rope. The significance of it is you're changing the bucket vis-a-vis the sky, not the bucket itself. Now, that being the case, when you play ping pong, the ball goes over the net and bounces on the table because the stars are there. If the stars weren't there, it wouldn't do that. All of a sudden, the stars become very important. Surprise, surprise. Other than that, you say, what a wasteful creation, Who needs all those stars? Well, if all inertial motion on the planet depends upon the existence of the stars, then they're playing a very important role. Without them, it wouldn't work. Now, this was Maxwell's principle for answering Newton's bucket experiment. Then along came Einstein. Einstein concocted a brand new set of rules, and I have asked physicists, is Maxwell's principle built into Einstein's theory or not? And interestingly, they say it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. Because he has curved space-time, he doesn't have gravity as a force. But at least what I learned from this is something which can look obviously superfluous, obviously without effect, obviously irrelevant, you could be dead wrong about it. Now think about ecology. 200 years ago, if you heard that the plankton in the sea are dying out, you say, so it'll be easier to sail. Sometimes they function as a drag on the hull of the ship, and now we'll go more fast and so on. You don't know about the food chain. Without plankton, the whole planet will die. You don't know that. But things are connected in ways that you didn't dream of. And there are those lovely chlorofluorocarbons, which were in the expellent gases of aerosols. And somehow they all knew to congregate over the South Pole, over Antarctica. Why did they go to the South Pole? Because it's unexplored. Who knows why they went to the South Pole? That's what they did, poking a hole in the ozone layer, and then that could be terribly dangerous. Things are connected in ways that we don't begin to understand. So when a person wants to make the judgment that we don't need all that stuff, and it's a complaint against God's efficiency that he put it there, a little caution and a little humility would be in order, because we really don't know how things are connected. Yeah.
Why would they need to conduct such experiments? Can't you use the sea as...
I'm sorry, say that again?
Why did Maxwell and the Newton need to conduct these experiments if they could just use the sea? There's only waves because it's relative to the way the moon is in the sky, the stars. Waves on the beach.
I'm not quite sure the question you're asking. It can't be the moon alone that accounts for the bucket experiment, because it happens when the moon's on the other side of the earth. So it can't be the moon alone.
So it's the stars as well.
I mean, the stars are a gigantic amount of mass.
That would be a proof of Maxwell way before, and you don't need to conduct an experiment to get
No. There's no proof here. Maxwell is responding to Newton's bucket by saying, your bucket doesn't prove your point. That doesn't mean it's not right. That means he's not proving that he's wrong. He's just saying it doesn't prove your point. You thought that by looking down at the water, you saw something that was produced only by the motion of the bucket all by itself. You thought that this motion would take place even if there were no stars and nothing to be relative to, because it's the motion of the bucket in and of itself, and that means it's absolute motion. I say, who told you? Maybe it's because of the relationship of the bucket to the stars that the water goes up, and therefore it isn't absolute motion. It's relative motion. So all he's doing is saying, you didn't prove your point. He's not proving him wrong. And Maxwell's not doing any experiment at all. He's reinterpreting the results of the experiment. Okay? Yeah.
I think this might cause an issue with the experiment, that centrifugal force isn't actually something that's real and tangible. It's just the conservation of momentum in the direction the water is moving from the motion of the bucket. If the water was a solid, it would move with the bucket. Because the water is not a solid, that's why it comes up the side in the way it does.
No, what you're saying is not correct. First of all, the solid will be distorted in the direction of the centrifugal force. It will suffer some distortion because there is a real effect being exercised on it. Yes, it's conservation of momentum. We know that, but conservation of momentum produces an effect in the outward direction from the center of the motion. That's what it does. Yeah. So it's not an original force. It's not a force in addition to all the other things we know about physics, but it's a real effect. I don't need it to be an original force to make the argument. Newton didn't need it to do that. Yeah.
What would Maxwell say in a case where you have one bucket spinning and one bucket not, in regards to the stars? How would you explain that?
Because
in isolation, you could say it's.
No, because one has motion relative to the stars, and the other doesn't have motion relative to the stars. When you sit on the edge of the bucket, look up at the stars, everything's very calm and peaceful. Just stays the way it is. The one that's over your head stays over your head. Nothing moves around, so on and so on. It's the relative motion that produces the water going up the side of the bucket. Not the absolute motion of the bucket alone, but the fact that it's moving vis-a-vis the stars. That's relative motion, yeah.
So then, what do we actually know about the relationship between stars and things that happen in the free will's lives?
We know some things, and we don't. I mean, a lot of other things we don't know. I don't know exactly what your question. You mean in terms of the things that God does? We have some interesting rules. I'll tell you one. If you're born under Mazel Ma'adim, of which the heavenly body is the planet Mars. So the Gemara says you will have a tendency to violence. Tendency, that's the crucial question, a tendency to violence. So the Gemara says such a person will either become a murderer, or he will slaughter animals for kosher meat, or he will be a doctor, and particularly a moel, who will do bris milah. Which means, if he tries to become a librarian, somebody's going to come in with a book that's overdue, and he's going to pull a ruler out of the desk and stab the guy. Violent he is, right? But that doesn't dictate his moral character. doesn't dictate the spiritual result of his violence. Nothing dictates that. Your free will can always take whatever resources you have and determine the moral and spiritual character of it. We have many, many examples of this. Shimon and Levi wiped out the whole city of Shechem. Jacob pronounced on them various conditions for their future existence, and one was that they're going to be scattered in the Jewish people. Their anger and their violence was too powerful, and he said, I don't want you concentrated, I want you scattered. But it happened in two vastly different ways. Levi became the ones who were responsible for certain activities in the Beis HaMikdash. They were supported by a public tax, produce tax of 10%, and they lived in 48 separate cities. They had no piece of geography that belonged to their tribe. They were scattered. That was so that because they had a lot of leisure time, they were able to learn Torah well, and they could teach Jews the Torah, and therefore they were scattered throughout the whole geography of the Jewish people. They were scattered, all right, in a matter of great glory, great honor. The tribe of Shimon was very poor, and they had to hire themselves out to other people in order to make a living, and the population scattered to find work. So both received the same words, the exact same words, but the way the words developed in actuality were very, very different from one another. That's typical of this kind of influence. The influence creates an objective circumstance which can then be used one way or another depending upon your free will. The stars do not determine your moral and spiritual character. They determine the circumstances under which you will develop your moral and spiritual character. But through your free will, you'll be able to elevate it or destroy it.
But what month did you say causes someone to have violent tendencies?
I don't remember when the Mazel Ma'adim, and actually it's a much more complicated system than that, because and this is not dependent upon astronomical activities at all. There are 7 mazalos, and they operate on an hourly basis, and it repeats, the cycle repeats, and because it's 7, so there are certain hours in the week, because the week has 7 days, so certain hours of the week that always get the same mazel. So for example, in regular time, from 6 to 7 Friday night is mazel ma'adim, this mazel of violence. And that's why some people have a custom not to make kiddush between 6 and 7 Friday night.
I've heard that.
You have heard that, okay?
That's I didn't know the reason why, but I have heard of people specifically not doing that. Either doing
Okay,
it
good.
or-
So that's the reason why. And of course, if you change daylight saving time, then it's 7 to 8. Not we don't care what the numbers on the clock is 6 to 7. And one of the rabbis that I know said, if you live in different places in the geography of a time zone, it shouldn't be the uniform time throughout 800 miles of the time zone. It should be where you are exactly on the geography of the earth. He said in Jerusalem it's probably 20 to 7 to 20 to 8, not 6 to 7. But okay, those are refinements. But that's the reason. And it's brought by one of the commentators of the Shulchan Aruch. It's a serious business.